Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on privacy. Before we actually go into the panel discussion, I actually want to introduce some people here, and then we'll get into what topics we will be discussing. As always, feel free to engage with us a little bit more. Feel free to add some comments on the chat, on the chat, or if you have any questions. We will be leaving a little bit of room for audience questions, so make sure that you get those on. So we have a really interesting panel over here, very qualified people with us. So starting off with Gemma. Gemma is a privacy associate at Osler's Privacy and Data Management Group. She's also a member of CAN Tech Women in Tech Law Committee. In addition to assisting clients with navigating privacy, she has also worked on pro bono matters relating to regulation of cyber sex trafficking. Welcome, Gemma, and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Next up, Saima. So Saima is a senior privacy specialist at Ontario Health. Her previous roles include privacy engineering at Twitter and senior privacy advisor at TELUS Health. Her work is cross-cutting across different disciplines, ranging from data privacy and security, engineering, health law, and AI privacy and ethics. Thanks, Saima, for joining us. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
And then we have Sophie. Sophie and I have personally worked on a lot of cases together. She's a principal in cybersecurity and privacy at BCG, data security, and she's had over 10 plus years of work experience with professional services with Fortune 500 and mid-sized clients at both the executive and the operational levels. Thanks a lot, Sophie, for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. And I am Shirin. I'm a board member of WiCyS Ontario chapter. If you are a part of WiCyS, make sure you're part of the Ontario chapter, but I'm a part of the WiCyS Ontario chapter. I'm the board there. I'm also a manager at BCG in their cybersecurity practice. And I've worked with several clients with the intersection of cybersecurity and privacy, and very excited to host this panel discussion on privacy and the femtech paradox. So let's get started. Firstly, very excited to have all of you on board today. Before we get into femtech industry and privacy, I really want to ask all of you, what about privacy is really exciting for you, and why did you choose to get into this field?
I can go first. I think I'm probably one of the youngest to the field. I'm in my second year of law. So I probably came at it a little bit differently than everyone else, just in the sense that I went through the traditional sort of undergrad and then law school route. And when I came to law school, I didn't really, have a conception of what privacy was or privacy law. I really fell into the field during doing my combined MBA program, where we got to work a lot with startups. And that was sort of when big data was really taking over the conversation, and everyone was talking about it. It's like, how are we going to use big data? How are we going to use AI? And I became really interested in those conversations and hearing about it from like the business side of things and the industry side of things. And then, back in law school, it sort of became this area of real interest to me. And, I'm sure everyone here today knows how much growth there's been in the field in the past few years. It's really exploded, and it's, all over the news now. And particularly in Canada, it's a really exciting time because we have like a lot of legislative reform. There's a lot of changes. And I think it's becoming more and more interdisciplinary, and more people from, different areas and industries are really starting to engage in these really interesting conversations. And, it's really shaping society. So that's what I find exciting about it. That's what I find interesting about it. And I've really learned a lot in the past few years, and I'm sure everything's going to change in the next few years or so as well.
Awesome.
Sure, I can go next. Hi all, my name is Saima Fancy. I am a chemical engineer and a biochemist by academic background. My background ranges from engineering to law to running manufacturing facilities. So I have a diversity of background, and my love for privacy was actually quite intentional. I very consciously entered into the field by way of getting certified after I saw the whole Cambridge Analytica mess up that happened, and I just got really intrigued as to what was happening. And I also found myself that whether I was in the legal field, and I'm not a lawyer, I was a scientific advisor to boutique personal injury and med mal law firms, or whether I was in the engineering sector, I was never quite satisfied. Really was looking for something that was cross-functional, cross-sectional, and data privacy and cybersecurity were it. This is where I can wear all of these hats. And at the core of my essence, I'm really crazy about human rights aspect of privacy. And that's what it comes down to, protecting people's privacy of the data that they willingly or unwillingly give off online. And I'm very passionate about that. And that's what drives me. And I find that this profession allows all those disciplines to exist in harmony, which is why I find this so exciting.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Sophie?
Yeah, I'll go next. Simon, I probably share some element with your experience. I started my career in traditional IT and IT security, where like 10, 12 years ago, I think my first company was debating the service name, and we used to be called network security or IT audit. I started in a very technical field, and one thing I always ask myself is, what is the value and why am I doing this, right? And I'm sitting in a lot of cubicles and looking at computer all day, and sometimes things doesn't feel real. It was about 2016 when, after GDPR rolled out, there were suddenly a lot of projects. Then I got into this project as part of the cybersecurity, data security project, and it started seems to making sense. And I really like it. I really like the value, the impact that bring to people. A lot of people suffer from data breach, suffer from privacy intrusive services that business, like unethical business impose on them. So I find this is something like make me very easy to explain to people why am I doing my job. And I think my most memorable moment is we went to a high school and talked to young girls about cybersecurity and data privacy. And I was trying to think about ways to make them excited. And I use analogies to say, when your grandma go to a hospital, we want her to get treated and not worry about her data being stolen by hackers. And we wanted to make sure her data is available when she go to another hospital, when she want to change services. And this is the value we're providing. So this is what I'm most excited about privacy, because we make real impact to everybody, to my parents, to myself, to our children, to our next generation.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for sharing that. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into today's hot topic, which was around femtech and surveillance. So before we get into the details of privacy with femtech and surveillance, really want to hear from you what this means. What is femtech, and what do we mean by surveillance data?
So I'm happy to start off on this one. I'm really interested in this topic. There's so much to say about it, but I kind of wanted to speak a little bit about like framing this concept of like the femtech paradox, because that's sort of what we've named this. And it's so interesting because there's such a tension in femtech, because historically and today, women are often marginalized from healthcare services, whether it's, from the health research, from the data that's collected. Women's pain is more often to be ignored or misdiagnosed. There's a lot of examples about female mortality being extremely high, particularly Black women when it comes to pregnancy. And, healthcare for women is becoming increasingly criminalized globally. And obviously this has a disproportionate impact on women of color. So there's been a lot of issues in the sort of traditional medical context. And so femtech has sort of arisen as a way to give women a sense of autonomy regarding their healthcare, providing a different space, different type of access to healthcare. And I think that it's really exploded exponentially over the past few years. And I think femtech sort of presents itself, it brands itself as this, feminist form of like knowing yourself kind of healthcare. It tries to sort of like align itself with these narratives of autonomy and empowerment, control over your reproductive life. But there is like this increasingly vocal chorus of criticism about how these technologies are designed, how data is then shared, sometimes without people's knowledge or consent, this reuse of data. And I think that this is really where all of us are going to focus our critique in this sort of like privacy and sort of reuse of data space. But before we get into that, I just want to quickly shout out some of the feminist aspects, because there is all these other concerns about how some of these apps actually like reinforce very negative conceptions of reproduction and what women's healthcare is. It can like, provide you with potentially like misinformation about what exactly is necessary, like the conceptions of like what feminine hygiene is, like what a clean vagina should be, those kinds of things. It also reinforces very traditional concepts of fertility, essentially saying that like the responsibility of reproduction is a woman's responsibility, and if you're not availing yourself of new technologies, if you're not participating in this, then you're probably doing something wrong. You're probably failing in some capacity, which is like a very sort of misogynistic way of viewing what reproductive rights are and reproductive autonomy. So that's something that like is not necessarily like a privacy issue, but I find is really interesting about these apps in general. And I just, from the surveillance perspective and how it interacts, and then I'll stop monologuing because I know everyone else has a lot of things to say about this. But it's one of those things where we're very into this sort of like quantification of self right now, like beyond just sort of the reproductive aspect, but like, there's like Fitbits, like fitness tracking apps, like all this kind of thing. And it's being used to just accumulate all this data sort of to what end, right? And so we can, say it's in order to give ourselves more control, but it really is sort of, for profit. And with the for-profit model, that data is going to go somewhere. It's going to be either used for advertising, data brokers, all that. And there's a lot of criticism right now specifically about the use of like government access. I think that this has arisen mostly in the US currently because of the criminalization of abortion and access to healthcare. And so people are deeply concerned about this deputization of the private sector that arises in many other industries as well as femtech, but this is particularly impactful on women right now. So that's sort of like how I see this paradox, this tension. To start.
Totally going to echo what Gemma is saying and adding on to it. So just looking at it from a clinical studies perspective, for example, there's a lot of clinical studies out there done on men. So for example, if you look at the cardiac side of things, you've got tons of studies on cardiac clinical research done on men, but not on women. And what they do is take that data and superimpose it on women. Well, women are very different from men. Our hearts function differently. The anatomy is a bit different. So those are the gender gaps that femtech tries to fill in. And some of the technology that's out there, just taking further to what Gemma was saying, and by the way, Gemma's laid out beautifully the philosophical aspect of why we're all here. That's what's driving us. And then taking that further into technology, we've got a lot of apps out there that are collecting data on women and misusing it. So like you were saying, the fitness apps, the period tracking apps, the fertility tracking apps. You've got all of these apps that are syncing into our phones. You've got surveillance apps through our telephones that are being abused by partners, for example. That's another level that we can talk about. And what are laws doing to protect this? Unfortunately, not too much. And a lot of the laws that would apply here are health-based laws. And we can take that further, but I'll hand it off to Sophie to add her bit.
Yeah, I think commercial surveillance is a new concept, but it's just in case any of the audience, right, is not familiar with the commercial surveillance definition. It's similar to like a CCTV, right, or camera pointing to people in a public area or in a store. Companies are increasingly interested in collecting data about who we are, what we do, what kind of decision we will make. And so they build a digital profile around us and predicting what we're doing. And for a lot of people, and I think it definitely have a cultural aspect, right? But for a lot of people, this is invasive. I think I remember hearing from a radio talk show, and the dad is like, my daughter find a pregnancy control commercial before she even realized she's pregnant. This is how powerful commercial surveillance is and how invasive it can be if it's not being controlled. And I think in terms of how bad this technology are, right, in addition to collecting extra data, right, misrepresent who we are, some of the unethical business, they have employed things like a dark pattern to trick women or trick any like consumer to give data, right, more than they necessarily need. And some companies will change the privacy term after they collect the data, which all violates common privacy regulation. And this is why we all care about it, right? Because we want to participate in the digital e-commerce, but we also want our right to be respected. Like, I don't want a commercial if I don't want to get it. I didn't think this is the whole idea we're talking about.
Sophie, I'll jump in and I'll say the reason these apps these commercial e-commerce type platforms can get away with it is because there are loopholes in the laws, right? So for example, if you take a look at HIPAA protects health data as far as clinicians are concerned. It doesn't protect health data that's being collected by our devices, right? Hence, there isn't that consent management piece. There is that loophole that they can take advantage of, and that parties then sold to third-party vendors. So yeah, for example, Target the commercials, the store was in the limelight. Sephora, Spin, Glow, Flow. These are all companies that have been charged now for not getting in an opt-out consent mechanism in place in their e-commerce site, and subsequently selling the data that they basically extracted without consent and selling it to third parties. So for example, a father finding out that his 16-year-old is pregnant because of the kinds of flyers that are coming to the house all of a sudden, right? So I do want to point out that both in Canada and America, there is that issue. Now, in the US is a little bit ahead of us. They are starting to become a lot more robust in changing their laws as far as consent management is concerned. So for example, if you look at California, CPRA is just amending CCPA by making it more robust. Opt-out is an option that everyone has to put on their e-commerce platform. Without that, they can't conduct their business. In Canada, we don't have that yet. For example, Joe, I'll let you step into that a bit more.
Yeah, and Simon, you bring up a really good point there. And it would be really good to understand, because as an end user, right, we assume that the laws are there to protect us. The laws are out there that are really, the laws are sufficient. But really with privacy, the way we see it is that each country, sometimes like in the US, you can also see sometimes different states have their own laws.
It's sectoral, yeah.
It's very sectoral. It really varies upon geography. It really depends on the governments and how much they want to focus on privacy. So really would like to get an overview of what these privacy laws are really looking like, and then get also a perspective of what does it mean for Canada? Where do we lie in this whole privacy laws perspective?
So with regards to the US, firstly, they don't have a federal overarching privacy law like we do. We've got PIPEDA here, soon to be hopefully Bill C-27, which is going through second reading in the House of Commons at the moment. So that will replace PIPEDA eventually. The US does not have that federal piece, which is why theirs is a more sectoral patchwork-based system of privacy laws. The most robust ones, states right now, are California, which is leading the way, which is very similar to the GDPR. You've got Utah, Virginia, Colorado, and there's one more that I'm missing. Those are the 5 really strong ones that the US has that are actually filling in this gap that I talked to you about with regards to the opt-out mechanism that's now is being enforced. In Canada, on the other hand, we're behind still. We are still waiting for C-27 to go through. It's a 3-piece Act. What I mean by that, it has 3 different portions to it, of which the AI regulation piece is being dropped off, unfortunately. So the other 2 will carry on, which will be a bit more robust than our old PIPEDA, which is quite antiquated now. It's very old. It's almost pre-internet. It needs to really come to speed and fill in the gaps that we see in all these apps that are collecting data so robustly. Innovation is moving way faster than regulation, and that gap needs to close. And unfortunately, we're not moving fast enough.
Just to add some color or a little bit of background for those that aren't as familiar with Canada's privacy laws, I agree with everything you said, and I do think it would be beneficial if Bill C-27 comes through, because it will hopefully align us a little bit more with GDPR. But Canada has like a consent-based regime, so everything is sort of grounded in this concept of express or implied consent or an exception to consent. We don't really have like legitimate interests in the way that the GDPR does, for better or worse, although our exceptions to consent sometimes like align. But one of the interesting things about Canada is we have like 33 different pieces of privacy legislation. We have like the federal laws, we have the provincial laws that are substantially similar to PIPEDA, and then we have the health privacy laws. But as we've talked about, in Canada, there is also a gap on when it comes to like femtech and sort of like these innovative health startup devices, because, you know, obviously it's a fact-based analysis, but a lot of times the health privacy legislation for the province won't always apply to those kinds of technologies because they don't fit the definition of like a health information custodian, or they're not technically providing like a health service. So there is a bit of a gray area, and normally you would have the private sector privacy legislation stepping in, and that does happen. And it, you know, we have a very principle-based regime, so like consent is required, but then you also have like this reasonable purposes concept. So ideally that's meant to sort of restrain organizations from using your data for things that are considered unreasonable, and health data is almost always considered sensitive. So we do have protections. They're just not necessarily as robust as you would want for something that's health information. And particularly, you know, when it comes to women's health, if women are using this as like a substitute for traditional healthcare, you would like to ensure that like there is a process for some kind of recourse that maybe, you know, doesn't exist in the private sector landscape in the same capacity that we would want. So yeah, we'll see how things change. As like we've all mentioned, like there is a lot of change. It will be interesting. And we don't really know exactly what the final form of this new legislation will look like. But we do hope that it will move towards the gold standard of GDPR, as everyone likes.
One of the things to add on to Gemma's point that we're missing in Canada is the redress mechanism. Sure, we've got a consent-driven based privacy legal system, but it's not reinforced, it's not punitive, for example. Where in the US, the FTC is coming down very hard. In the EU, the courts of justice there are coming down very hard on companies that are violating this whole consent management piece. We have yet to get there. And that is why a lot of companies are able to get away with violating what the prescribed processes are in our laws. So I'm hoping that that's something that will become more robust. One of the things that C-27 is outlining is for a tribunal to be set up. However, it's unclear right now whether the OPC will be granted order-making rules. That's, I think, yet to be determined. On the other hand, Quebec, though, it's got quite a bit of teeth, Bill 64. It's robust, it's strong, it's very driven on the consent management piece, which is a really good thing. It brings a lot of hope.
Yeah, and I want to bring in Sophie here. I want to ask you really, because I know you've done a lot of work on GDPR and you work with a lot of global clients. So this is the case that's happening in Canada. I really want to get your perspective. If we move our industries, or if we're moving our technology so that it's compliant with something that we, you know, more focused on GDPR, which we are considering the gold standard, is that sufficient, or are there still some gaps there?
Even after GDPR was enacted for many years, right, we still find companies are being fined heavily for incompliance. This is the same. So I think just having laws is not enough, right? To Simon's point earlier, right? There need to be very effective enforcement. Some companies, their approach is, unless someone knocking my door, I would just trade things doesn't exist. So active enforcement is definitely going to help. And I think globally, right? Many government or regulator are closing the gap. There are many countries US, we're also proposing a new federal law, right? In the meantime, FTC is proposed new rulemaking on privacy. They are actually actively enforcing healthcare data outside of HIPAA under Section 5 as the fraudulent activity. So active enforcement from government across the globe is happening. I do think for consumer facing industry, they're also so we help a lot of clients, right, in hospitality, in retail. For them, we always ask them, like, you need to think about whether what you're doing today is enough, right? You always need to tap into the regulatory change and then stay a little bit ahead of the regulatory curve, right? Today you can get away, tomorrow it might not be. And the most important thing is, do you want to build your trust with your consumer base, right? Marriott was hacked, they suffered, right? Then they come back. Their privacy practices are probably one of the leading, right? Apple got rewarded because of their good privacy and the security, and they've even put privacy on billboard in cities. Because I think regulatory enforcement, right, help guide the company to do the bare minimum. And also, I think the market, the more we care as a consumer, the more we demand good practice from business, is also going to help. And I just want to add one more thing, right? For Canadian company, you also need to pay attention to regulation that's extraterritorial, like GDPR, meaning whether you're based in Canada or not, as long as you have you provide service and sell goods to citizens for example, in Europe, you're still subject to GDPR, right? And as a global company, you cannot approach privacy in a very fragmented way to say, I do a little bit extra in Europe, and then we do very bare minimum in India, right? It's really hard for you to achieve global compliance. We typically recommend a client to look at their business geographic area and I say, can you do a little bit better? Yeah, there's some benefit of economy of scale if you improve your data practice, your data privacy protection, and gain more consumer trust to engage with you, to trust you, to advertise to them. So a little bit of both.
Yeah, and really coming from a consumer point of view, Karen raised a good question there on can we assure consent in our technologies? And I think what she's really getting at is, what does it really mean, right? For the end user, like when we're saying, okay, we want consent, and we're talking a lot about like legal terms, but as an end user, what does it mean for me when I'm saying, okay, I'm giving consent or I'm not giving consent? And what does it mean for the company? What do they really have to do in order to make sure that it happens? And where is the gap really right now?
Okay, so let's just pick up on something that Sophie just said, and which is the piece on trust, right? So it all comes down to trust, consumers trusting the company who's providing the service to them. Trust is earned in drops, but can be lost in buckets if the company does something wrong. So going back to this whole concept, the overlying or the overarching thesis of what we're talking about today is privacy within the femtech sector, right? So what is femtech? Femtech is technology catering products and services to women's needs. It can be people of binary background, BIPOC women, etc. The female technology industry is marked at about $51.6 billion as of end of last year. It's a significant market that requires some significant attention. So what does that mean when you give consent and your data does get collected? Well, hey, this is where privacy by design principles need to come in terms of the technology that needs to be designed being privacy centric in mind. So what does that mean? That means when this data is coming in, say person X has said, yes, go ahead, collect this data, give me my analytics based on the period tracking, the data that I'm entering. Well, that when that data comes in, it needs to be tagged, classified, mapped accordingly, such that the SaaS-based software here understands that this is personal health information or personally identifiable information that's coming in, treated with care. Or did this person opt in, opt out accordingly, diversify that data, and then treat it accordingly. Hold it for the amount of time needed, use it for the purpose that the consent is being provided for, and that's it. Hence the concept of data minimization and the 7 principles of privacy by design being implemented from the ingest of the data until the output occurs. So in the privacy and security field, there's the whole shift left mentality. So essentially, go back to the point when the data is being collected, put in the tools to process that data accordingly. So what are some of those tools? They're privacy enhancing tools like homomorphic encryption, differential privacy. This is where the technical side of things come in. When these tools are implemented, for example, the data can be anonymized. So person X can't be re-identified, should not be able to be identified. If that data is going to be used for analytics, again, assuming the person X has opted in. So there's a lot of that thinking needed as well in conjunction with compliance to regulation. Together, trust can be earned for the service provider with the customer that they have on their platform.
Yeah. To add to that, I think the privacy by design comments are so essential. Like so much of this comes down to like conceptualizing design. And like from the legal perspective, like there are ways to obtain consent, and most of that comes down to explaining things clearly so people fully understand what they're consenting to, explaining the purposes for collection and use, and making sure that it's only used for a reasonable purpose. Like someone can't consent to something that's unreasonable. So like there are those sort of principles that you can abide by, but the design thing is so interesting. And I think this is where like I get a little bit like this is a really tricky question, because I sort of see some of the harms or the risks that come out of this sort of like indiscriminate data collection and indiscriminate use. It's kind of like a collective issue, but privacy is very individualistic, like in the sense of like we think about it as my privacy, my right to privacy, my right to be left alone. But often people are like, well, I don't really care if like someone collects this, like all this data on me and like serves me an ad. Like, I don't really care about that. But it's sort of like that individual example isn't necessarily where the harm is going to come in. It's going to come down the road when you have everyone saying that they don't care, and then it's aggregated, and then all of a sudden like you're in a category of person, and as like a woman or a person of color, that category is often marginalized. The data on you is often inaccurate because the questions people are asking are like irrelevant or incorrect or very limited. So it becomes really hard to figure out how to adequately design these apps that are collecting data, because your output is only going to be as good as your input. And if you're, someone who has no idea what women's needs are, or only thinks about like what a woman is in a very like traditional heteronormative sense, then a lot of what you're going to be collecting or what you're going to be designing for is not going to be very effective in terms of creating like a product or, an end output that, is helpful or useful. And it might just end up reinforcing a lot of, biases, stereotypes. So I think the design thing is one of the most important questions, one of the hardest questions to really answer. Because like it's easy for a lawyer to be like, well, explain what you're saying, make sure you're being transparent. But it's like when it comes down to like actually figuring out how to implement a lot of that, it's a real process. And I think that it requires collaboration. But again, like the tech space is kind of white and male, and like not only that, not only just the tech space, like let's say that there's X amount of like women that are CEOs and founders, but if the people that are giving them money and are choosing to invest in these startups are all men, because again, finance is very male dominated, then they're going to be the ones that decide what to invest in and what they think women would be interested in, which is normally just like stupid. Like, so I don't know, like it's a really good question, and I'm still thinking about it, and I don't have a good answer. Just
Yeah, and you're right, Gemma. There's a lot of ambiguity in this area, right? And that brings us down to a discussion that's quite active on LinkedIn right now as to a new emerging profession called privacy engineering, where you've got the engineering piece, the legal piece, you've got the somebody who understands both sides of the spectrum and can speak to everybody who's involved, including people who are in HR, people in marketing, because at the end of the day, these companies do need to make money too. So say they're completely good people and they're complying with consent management rules and whatnot, but they can't draw the analytics they need to make money. It's all about monetizing. Well, how can they do that in a privacy conscious manner, right? We need people who can talk all these languages and work with all the different moving parts of a company. And only then, I think, can we come closer to designing close to a perfect model. I don't think it'll ever be perfect, but something that comes close to it. But we're far away from it at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, Shireen, let me answer Karen's question a little bit more directly. So there are different level of consent maturity, or in terms of how privacy friendly it is, right? Different law have a little bit different level of requirements on consent. But if you're a web developer, you definitely need cookie consent. That's one thing for your website. If you collect data, for example, you allow someone to sign up for your royalty or membership, you also need a consent mechanism. The difference is, right, do you do opt-in or opt-out? Opt-in means like by default, you're not in. You have to expressly say, I want to in without like, and then do action. Opt-out means your default to agree unless you say, no, I don't want to be in, right? And by that comparison, opt-in is more safe, more protective to consumer than opt-out, but not every law require opt-in, and depending on the strictness of the law. As a consumer, what you need to pay attention is when you open a mobile app, right? When you're on a website, pay attention to the cookie consent and pay attention to like account sign up consent whenever you give data, and find out what the company do. And did they tell you what they do with your data, right? That's one thing. The other thing is you also need to look at it. Do they have something to say, do not sell my data? This is a requirement in California. I don't know. I don't think it's in Canada yet, right? But educate your friends, your family, your children, right, to pay attention to those things when they're in digital space. There are ways to track that. DuckDuckGo has a tracker radar that you can look at which site is tracking you. You can also implement, you can tell the browser to every website you're visiting to say, do not track me. And some jurisdiction require a company to honor that. So you don't have to tell every website you don't want to be tracked. You should leverage your browser to say, I don't want to be tracked. It's called global privacy setting. I don't think that in every part of the world, right, businesses are required, but regulators are looking into it. Sephora was fined because of that and violate the California privacy law. So there are things we can do. There are also things that we can do to help the company we're working with, right, to educate them, like this is what you need to change to your website. This is what you need to change to your ad tech or marketing tool.
Yeah. And, we've been talking a lot about data and collecting data, especially with these big organizations. I actually want to move a little bit onto that. So we know AI is really taking up. AI is collecting a lot of our data. And so really want to understand, what does privacy mean in terms of AI? And what does privacy mean when we're talking about AI in the femtech industry? So want to get a sense of what that really means for us.
Yeah,
I'm going to go ahead, Jen. Go ahead, Jenna.
Okay, just to start the ball rolling, AI technically is not regulated yet in Canada in the sense that there isn't specific legislation that addresses it. As we've mentioned before, Bill C-27 is coming up. There are some provisions in that address automated decision-making. Quebec has new provisions. I think some of them are coming into force, if not already, specifically deal with the automated decision-making aspect of it. And then there's the ADA bill, which has been severed from Bill C-27, but will still be discussed and maybe eventually implemented, depending on what changes they make. It's kind of vague right now. But yeah, so currently right now, AI is regulated in the same way any sort of data collection is, just by our typical like federal, provincial privacy laws. And so it's very much about collection, reasonable purposes. And so I think people see that as a gap, because there's a lot of concern right now about how AI is being applied in sensitive contexts. And those contexts are often, areas that impact human rights. It's kind of interesting. Like the most times I see AI come up is like employment, insurance, health, and like policing. And it's just like the areas where you would hope that there would be, some sort of due process or some, way to achieve recourse, as we've touched on it before, and yet there is currently, it's just the normal sort of privacy route, so through the commissioners. So yeah, there is a movement to sort of address this in Canada, but I can't speak to GDPR and California. They have.
Yeah, just adding on to Gemma's points with regards to use of artificial intelligence in Canada. If you all remember, just about a year or so ago, Clearview AI got into a lot of trouble in Canada with regards to scraping data off the net indiscriminately and using it and selling it to various police entities around Canada. There is no redress mechanism per se at the moment, to add to Gemma's point, but artificial intelligence is developing at a rapid rate. There are amazing companies within Canada and America working on developing privacy enhancing technologies to embed within AI tech to be mindful of privacy. I had mentioned earlier about homomorphic encryption and anonymization tools, differential privacy. One thing about Canadian companies or Canada at large is that we tend to be a very compliant nature people compared to other parts of the world. I'm proud of that. One of the number one under PIPEDA is accountability. We were one of the first countries in the world to bring that principle in and hone it in. And I'm proud to say I think Canadians tend to abide by that. But as far as it being there being a redress mechanism, enforceability, we're not there yet. EU is almost. California is coming there, but there's a ways to go.
Yeah. So I would just want to add it, right? If you see your data being collected for an AI, there's a couple of things you need to think about. One is, are they going to use the data they collected for one purpose and repurpose it for another training objective, right? Let's say they collect it because you want to track your cycle, you want to better manage your health, right? But they say, oh, wow, why do I use it to predict your fertility? And without telling you, that's not good, right? They cannot just—
secondary use is not allowed.
Yeah. They cannot do that, right? And then you probably won't be able to find out, but you can certainly like pay attention to that, right? And the second thing is what they do with your data, because in terms of today's AI training, a lot of companies or organizations, especially in healthcare, right, they share data. So for example, they share the data to another company to train the algorithm, or some companies send algorithm to your data and then train and go to another data set, right? When your data is being shared, right, you worry about the risk of them being shared with a third entity, right? How secure is that third and fourth entity? So that's a secondary areas to definitely pay attention to. And the last thing, this is something regulated by GDPR, which is called automated decision. And in GDPR, there's a requirement that allow consumer to say, I don't want to be subject to profiling. I don't want an AI to determine whether my resume is good enough for the job. So they require business to give you a right to object to automated profiling, to say, I want a human to make the decision for me. So I think those are three things, like the data being used for the secondary use of your data being shared with other party you are not aware of, right? And do you want to subject to the automated decision where the law does not exist, right? I think as technologists, right, as a woman in tech, we should all think about promoting responsible AI. There are industry alliance to promote responsible use of AI. And if you're part of like AI project, right, think about asking your team, without law, without regulatory requirements, are we doing ethical things, right? Is this what we want to do if this is my data?
I just want to clarify one thing very quickly, because I feel like we said a lot that like there's no enforcement in Canada, and we don't have like a right to object in the way that GDPR does, but we do have, and it's just not monetary enforcement. Like there is a privacy commissioner, they do investigate, they do issue reports, and you know that can be taken to federal court and reviewed by federal court. The privacy commissioner doesn't necessarily have the ability to force companies to follow their recommendations, but having mentioned Clearview AI, even though they weren't able to like levy a penalty or anything, Clearview got out of Canada because the commissioner was like, can't do that. So that it's like, it doesn't sound, I feel like we've made it sound more bleak than it really is, but there are some methods of recourse, just not anything that's financially oriented currently.
Agree, Gemma. Once the OPC gets a complaint and they investigate, they do have mechanisms in place where they can go to federal court and get the court to enforce their recommendations. That definitely does exist here. And I think a lot of times when the OPC issues a stern letter, a lot of times within Canada, that does the trick. To Gemma's point, you're right. Again, going back to the fact that Canadian companies tend to be quite compliant in comparison to global companies, especially due to that accountability mechanism that we have in place. It does go far.
Yeah, and especially I think when it comes to AI data, and we're talking about women today, femtech, and some technologies that are to do with men and women, sometimes this data also gets very biased. So we want to make sure that we have the right laws in place to make sure that the data that we consent to is the only data that is being used for AI purposes.
And that's a problem all over the world. Algorithmic Justice League is one NGO that's working quite strongly under the leadership of Dr. Joy Bolwani in the US. She's doing amazing things. She's coming out of MIT on which she calls dirty data. So data that's biased, that's being ingested into the SaaS product and giving out definitely biased opinions. For example, you'll have a husband and wife going in to get a credit line. You know, if she gets approved, she'll definitely probably get less amount than her husband will, even if her husband earns less than her. These are actual use cases that have happened in the US. For example, if a Black man is up for surgery and a white man is, the white man will get the date first, right? So there's, to your point, and what they call dirty data. A lot of ethicists are working on having that rectified, but we've got a ways to go. And that's a problem all over the world.
Yeah, I know we have about 12 minutes left. I really like Mary Lee's question. Mary Lee, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, or do you want me to paraphrase it? Is it Mary Lee or? Okay, please paraphrase. Okay, so I think what she's really asking is the Canadian government's distance in legislative policy in favor of citizens' privacy versus corporate interest. So where is the Canadian government's interest really? Whether is it in privacy or is it in the corporate interest? And any opinions there? And
well, I think our commissioner is very interested in privacy as a human right. That's been a real emphasis in a lot of the rhetoric. I think the government is interested in striking a balance. Like, I think that they're not trying to shy away from promoting economic interests. And I think arguably there are parts of the GDPR that are better at facilitating companies' use of data than Canada necessarily. So I do think that it's oriented towards striking a balance, but I think we've seen a shift recently in recognizing privacy as sort of, I mean, Canada talks about it all the time as like quasi-constitutional, like it's there. And I think that people now want to recognize it more as a human right. But I think they're not ever going to like completely ignore the economic interests of business. Although I don't know, maybe Quebec has decided they don't care based on something. But like that's my 2 cents. I don't really have any insight beyond that.
Taking your point a bit further, under Bill C-27, there will be a tribunal mechanism set up for appeals and complaints to go forward. We've never had anything like that before, federally speaking, so that's a good sign. How it's going to work, the details have yet to be sorted out, but that's a step in the positive direction as far as Canada is concerned. In the US, it's quite robust. You go to the FTC, the FTC is strong. They come hard at companies. As you've seen, up-teen amounts of fines being posted against Facebook, Google, all these companies are getting into trouble constantly. FTC is hard with their words, as the EU courts are.
Right.
We also have a lobbyist who are trying to reverse it. I think in every country there's like different group of promoting, advocating. It's sort of philosophical difference. But glad to see in some part of the world, right, the privacy is advancing, and globally, just by the amount of new laws being passed, the amount of enforcement, especially on giant tech. The big tech are the one imposing most commercial surveillance, right? And seeing some of the regulator taking the lead, right, and send the message, I think is hopeful, and just part of the words need to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this question also stems from really the fact that the big corporations, the tech industry now makes so much money. So they are the big corporations. Economically, they're driving a lot of the revenues. They're giving a lot of taxes. So how do you really, maintain the balance between that and what is better for the public interest? So obviously, the government should be doing what's good for the public interest, but this is where the tech companies are actually what is generating the revenue, and a lot of the times are violating the privacy laws. So I think this stems into, her next question, which is really that what can we do to really push for stronger policies and laws and regulations with privacy?
I mean, it's hard to put the onus on the individual to be completely responsible. I think generally just being conscientious of the types of apps that you're using, the types of companies that you're selecting for. I think Sophie mentioned Apple has been really into branding themselves as privacy forward, maybe sometimes interrogating some of that. I do think that just having more people with a broader background and diverse experiences is really important, and in terms of just getting involved in the industry. I think that will really impact a lot of things. We can't blame white men for everything, but I do think that there is a very narrow perspective sometimes in a lot of these industries and spaces, and that drives a lot of different kinds of priorities. So I do think having really, diverse experiences and backgrounds in these spaces to help drive design and drive sort of what is a priority for these organizations is really important. Because if you have a group of people that are within that industry, within that business, that are hey, this is important to me. And as Sophie said, if you have someone being I'm going to now think about what is ethical beyond what is just the legal requirement, that is important to have those voices in those rooms. So I think that, that's hard to say as a consumer, but I think all of us here, we'll have that opportunity. So it's good to remember that you can contribute something.
Well, we're talking about this, aren't we? So the conversation's begun. And as such, in all corporations, all across the board, these conversations have to happen in boardrooms and by the water coolers, the coffee chats, right? This profession has to proliferate, not just as privacy folks alone. It has to emanate throughout the pipeline. The HR people need to talk about it. The advertisers need to talk about it. Everyone in the boardrooms, in the forefront, everybody needs to talk about it. The software engineers need to deal with it. A lot of times they see privacy folks as disablers of innovation, but no, if we bring this culture and we embed it throughout the system and architectural design pipeline, the data flow pipeline, it can work. This is a shift of mindset. It's a shift of culture. We need to teach our children. The first thing that happens when a baby's born, the 6 months they're 6 month old, we just stick a phone in their hands. Right? That education element has to come in. I think it needs to be taught in schools. It's not taught. Kids rights are constantly violated in terms of privacy infractions. I think it's coming down to that, and it's being more talked about. And as we talk about it some more, just like any other social issue, more light will be brought to it.
Yeah, I do want to bring up, I know we have only 5 minutes left. So I really want to focus on another topic here, because we have a lot of, students or cybersecurity professionals who are interested in getting into privacy. So pivoting a little bit, want to really understand, as a cybersecurity professional, what's my way to get into privacy and become a privacy specialist, whether it's privacy by design or something else. How do I get into this domain?
I mean, my experience is very niche. Like, I'm a lawyer, I went to law school and I got into it through that. So I don't know, how helpful that is for people to hear. I also have like the CIPPC certification. I did that on top of things. So I'm going to let the other two speak more, because I don't have that much to contribute, but you can Google me. And if anyone has questions about privacy law and privacy lawyer, happy to answer. Coffee chats, emails, whatever. So I'll throw that out there.
So my background is in engineering and law as well, but law by way of practice as a scientific advisor. And my biochemistry background, I was able to leverage all of that and harness my interest in privacy. I too have a CIPC. I also went to Carnegie Mellon and did a privacy engineering certification. I also did one with data protocol. I went to University of Michigan. So basically, I went to University of Northeastern in the US and went to Faculty of Law and picked some courses. So essentially customized it based on my interests, and got a hold of a lot of folks on LinkedIn, network, reach out to all of us. And that's the best way to learn about it. It's being taught in different universities, colleges, pick up courses, talk to people, go to conferences, become a member of the IAPP. Best ways to do this.
Sophia?
Yeah, I did not study privacy, but I think if you are studying in any of the IT field, if it's not law or engineering, similar to Gemma and Nasaima, it just simply in data security or cybersecurity, you are already learning transferable adjacent skill set, right? To be a privacy requirement analyst, right? And in fact, doing cybersecurity is helping company fulfilling part of their data privacy protection responsibility, which is to secure the consumer data. And if you're just a study like a general IT management or computer science, you also can do a lot, right, to dive into the privacy field, because you would probably need to understand the data architecture, right, understand the data pipeline, draw data flow diagram. And Shreen and I, we have done a thorough use case data diagram, system diagram analysis to help the company to pinpoint where the data privacy data is, so they can protect the system that is processing. So if you're in data, you're in IT, you're in business analyst, you're in architecture, you can contribute to privacy. You can raise your hand up and say, hey, I want to do some privacy work, whether that's a privacy engineering or data privacy architecture, or help some of your team, right, to understand, right, where
I'll give you
a
very quick story. Like you said, coming from any kind of background, you can get into privacy. So when I was at Twitter, one of my colleagues was a ballerina before she became a software security privacy engineer. And it was a passion she developed herself. And then she went to different third-party vendors like Google, Microsoft, and whatnot, picked up different courses, stitched it together, customized it, went to Uber, went to Netflix, went to Twitter, and there she was. And she's doing really well.
Yeah.
Wow.
And some very practical recommendation, right? The book you study for CIPP EU exam is actually really good. It's really boring. It's a thick book, but it talks about the background of the most comprehensive first, right? Like a gold standards of privacy law. And I highly recommend anyone truly interested in this profession, right, to find that book or find similar material to understand GDPR, because like this is the most comprehensive. Once you understand GDPR, you will find a lot of the other laws are very easy to absorb. And also, I think there's a very famous Canadian paper written by the professor, like it's called 7 Principles of Data, what is the name? A fair processing of data. I can find the article, but it talk about the 7 principles of data protection. It's like a 5-page paper. Highly recommend to read that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we're just at time. So if anyone has any final comments, please feel free to leave it on chat. We'll stick around for a little bit if anyone wants to talk or discuss anything. But thanks a lot for tuning in, and thank you for all three of our panelists for doing such a great job and for telling us so much and for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
Yeah, happy to.